Welcome back to Racing Rundown here on YouTube. I'm Eric DeCoster. It's another Breeders Cup individual race preview here on the channel. Of course, I hope you've already checked out our Breeders Cup Classic preview that both me and Jack did together, as we usually split up every other race. And I know Matt Cody will also be joining us to handle a few of those races. But our big one is the Classic, although I'm pretty sure not much insight is needed there. But still a good listen for some other ideas on some other horses not named Flightline. And in this preview, we'll be taking a look at the Juvenile. Might play out a little similarly in the sense of the Classic, maybe a little less cut and dry, but certainly one horse stands out among the rest, and that is Bob Baffert's Cave Rock. Baffert looks for another win in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile. Of course, he's always loaded with the 2-year-olds, and we saw last year him take it out with Corniche, and I think Cave Rock is a lot better. Probably a tougher group at the same time, but this is a horse who does a lot of good running. But we'll get to him. We're going to go through every single horse in the race, and we'll start with the one Hurricane J. Pretty big long shot coming from the Paulo Lobo barn. He has local experience. He won an allowance race over this Keeneland course in his most recent start. That was on October 8th in a first level allowance, wire to wire. Strong win. He'll be going 2 turns for the first time, and he should be able to handle that okay. I don't think distance is going to be what gets him beat here, but he has been slow. I mean, the numbers haven't returned well. Visually, he hasn't blown anyone else out of the water. He's a decent horse. There's certainly some positives to him, and he's still improving. But this is a big leap up from an easier allowance to the toughest 2-year-old race of the year. He's well related, though. His pedigree is a couple horses that all of his siblings, I should say, are stakes performers, and some were good, some were bad, but nevertheless, decent family, and 2 turns shouldn't be out of the wheelhouse based off pedigree either. But he doesn't seem like he's a major contender in any sort here. I will say he is a big player in terms of a pace setup, but I'll touch a bit more on that when we get up to Cave Rock. The 2 is another price that'd be Congruent, a horse who I think is pretty decent, but once again, too much too soon. I think him and Hurricane J have very similar projections right now in terms of where they could be 4 months from now, and that's, I think, players on the Derby trail in some of the minor races. But for now, this is a spot that comes up a bit early in their careers. Congruent, 2 for 4 lifetime. Broke his maiden in start number 2 very impressively, and then bounced back poorly in an allowance race at Delaware, and then in an off-the-turf version of the Laurel Futurity on the 1st of October. Really good effort. Moved through nicely towards the inside, bursted through when it mattered, finished strong over the sloppy track, a track he clearly relished. Just a lot of good from Congruent in that effort, and I think getting out to 2 turns a mile and a 16th will be beneficial to him. He's a horse that has a big stride, and he's very well bred to go longer in his races. But he is also a couple low. I mean, there's multiple Grade 1 winners in here, each who are big players, and it would be a big upset. This is a horse I think can keep developing and actually be a pretty talented sophomore next year. But as things stand right now, comes up a bit too soon. Your 3 is Cave Rock. That's your 4 to 5 morning line favorite. Bob Baffert once again goes for another win in this race. Juan Hernandez, who's been aboard for all 3 starts, comes back here. This horse has just been dominant. 6-length win, 5 1/4 length win in his 2 Grade 1 tries. Just a horse that takes care of business. And I think it's fair to say maybe he hasn't beat the best. I mean, he beat home 3 stablemates, 2nd through 4th in the American Pharoah, and the field in the Del Mar Futurity wasn't much better. I mean, the runner-up was a stablemate as well, and the 3rd-place finisher was a maiden. So he hasn't beaten much, but you can just tell this horse breathes different air. He is putting away horses with ease. He's beating everybody in his path. I think this is a pretty decent 2-year-old crop, and I think this guy just stands out. He has the precocity to win a race like this. He has the physical build to withstand a mile and a 16th. Again, he has the physical ability to withstand any pace. I mean, this is a horse who just won going 2 turns, looking better than ever, setting a career-high figure on all standards. And before that, he went 43-3 for the half in the Del Mar Futurity, a pace he set, and he outran his stablemate, having a meltdown, who's a heck of a sprinter in his own right. So he just does it all right. And when I was talking about Hurricane J, I said there is one thing about him that makes him interesting, and that's he'll be a pace player. I mean, he's stretching out from sprints to a route, and he's had a lot of speed in his sprints, and he has an inside draw, so you just know he's going to be on the gun in the early going. And Cave Rock, he hasn't shown any ability to rate, so he's going to be there too. But I don't think it really matters. If I go back to that Del Mar Futurity, all that tells me is this horse can withstand any pace, because if he withstood that, he can withstand anything. So I just think there are very few, if any, holes you can poke in Cave Rock. I certainly haven't found it other than maybe the competition aspect, but talent triumphs over competition every day of the week for me. So Cave Rock seems like a stone-cold lock in my eyes here. But, of course, there's some other horses that we'll touch on. We'll get into the meat of his competition now with the 4 Forte. He's your 4-1 second choice. On the morning line, Irad Ortiz, Todd Pletcher. The connections here from Micropolio, of course, they're trying to put together a pretty solid weekend. Nest, of course, in the distaff on Saturday. Also a banner horse for this barn. Forte, 3-for-4 lifetime. Turned a lot of good hairs, even in his lone defeat. Stretched out really nicely, too. And that's something you could probably tell. Offspring of Violence tend to be sprinters, but there's a lot of stamina coming from that dam side, and that was fully shown in the Breeders' Futurity, where he's had a perfect mid-pack trip, navigated traffic very well under Irad Ortiz, burst through when it mattered. Kind of bumped around. He was a little green in there. I think that's something he's shown a little bit in a handful of his starts, but boy, was he impressive. And certainly very little to knock based off of his win there. Two back, he won the Hopeful. It was a weird track that day that he clearly relished, but he did beat Blazing Sevens, who, of course, came back to win the Champagne, and we'll talk about him in a couple of horses. So he's done all the right things. The question is he good enough to beat Cave Rock? Probably not. Certainly the figures wouldn't reflect that, and I don't think even visually there's nothing that stands out to me. But he's been a nice horse, and I think he's certainly faced the toughest horses throughout the Derby, or the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Trail. Blazing Sevens in a pretty tough Hopeful. He ran in a loaded Sanford, it looked like. Breeders' Futurity, a lot of good horses. Loggins, the horse he outran, looks like probably the Breeders' Cup favorite in my eyes as things stand outside of Cave Rock. So the point is he has handled the toughest competition, and he's done it well every time, and he really relished this course and distance last time. And it's worth noting that course and distance experience in the Juvenile at Keeneland has been beneficial. You go back to Essential Quality. When he won it 2 years ago, he was coming off of Breeders' Futurity, and the Breeders' Futurity is just a good prep. So Forte makes a lot of sense. It's just Cave Rock stands in the way. I could totally see someone trying. The value will be there more so than on Cave Rock. But at the end of the day, a winner is a winner no matter the odds. So he does have to overcome one, but expect a big race from this guy. Verifying is the 5. Broke his maid nicely at Saratoga, followed it up with a good second in the Champagne. Has been good, but just hasn't taken it to the level where I think he can win this race. The Champagne kind of beat some has-beens and then lost to Blazing Sevens, and he's had a really good trip. The pace did not benefit Blazing Sevens as much as it benefited Verifying, and while he just kind of grinded away, it was nothing special, and that's kind of all his few starts have been. And maybe he's one of those horses that just does enough for himself to get the job done, but that's something I'm going to have to wait and see on. I don't think he's any better than the prep race winners, maybe even Lost Ark. He could maybe factor in some sense underneath based off that one run, but it would have to continue a progressive, projection, right? He's decent enough maiden win, probably got a little better in the Champagne, but he would really still need to take a step or two forward to be a player in here. So just questions he still has to answer, and it seems like there's at least 2 or 3 that are better than him. Blazing Sevens is the 6. He beat Verifying in the Champagne. Blazing Sevens, really strong winner that day. Certainly went off at odds a bit higher than I think he actually should have been, and that certainly benefited anybody who backed him because he came from well off the pace. And really, let's backtrack to the Hopeful. 2 back. He was coming off a very sharp maiden win early on in the Saratoga meet. It looked like he could play with anybody. Went off 4-1 in the Hopeful. Horse made sense in there, but he just was not getting a hold of that off track. And he gained late, but 14 Blazing Sevens had already shot away. So it was he was running for third no matter what. But in the Champagne, things were better. And I don't think it's because Forte was there. I think some people might construe it that way. I think they might say Forte was just that much better than Blazing Sevens, and that's why he was beaten. And then Blazing Sevens caught an easier field, and that's why he was third in the Champagne. Or that's why he won the Champagne by 3 lengths, And yeah, I can totally see that case. But I also think that Blazing Sevens got over that aqueduct track a little bit better, and I think he was able to grind away there. He just looked a little bit more comfortable second time in the slops, all of those different factors. And I think the added distance is huge here. It doesn't take a genius to look at the Sire Good Magic and think about what he did in his career, how he made a start, ran runner-up in the Champagne, and then really blossomed when he got out to a 2-turn mile on a 16th. And that's what Blazing Sevens gets to do for the first time here. So I think this is a horse who's going to continue his progression. I think he's a little intriguing. I, once again, don't think he's any better than Cave Rock, but he's a horse I expect to run strong getting this added ground. I think more so than any other horse in this field. So for that reason, he's a horse I'm definitely going to look towards underneath. Maybe look to him in a 3-6 exacta type of situation, because that's certainly where your money's going to be made if you're playing this race. But I think he's intriguing. He's a horse who really took a step forward, or showed his true colors at least in the Champagne, and I think he can do a little better with some added ground. The 7's a big long shot. That is wound up for Michael McCarthy. I'm going to guess this was a Paul Redham decision to run this horse in the Breeders' Cup, in the Juvenile, no less. This will be his first ever try on the dirt. This will be his first start at the distance, and this will be his first, or not his first attempt, I should say. This is his attempt to finally run well in a stakes race, which he's ran into, hasn't been much of a factor. 7th in the Del Mar Juvenile Turf, 5th in the Speakeasy, going 5 furlong. Again, he had a tough trip there, but I don't really think it matters too much in this spot. This is a colt who broke his maiden nicely on debut. I mean, there were certainly positives to take away from that performance, but that's really it. I mean, he hasn't had done much since. In terms of handling the dirt, I don't really think it'll be a problem. I look at who he's by, Mendelssohn, and Mendelssohn's can be versatile. Probably better turf horses, but versatile nonetheless. There's not much on the dam side, but I will say it probably does play towards the dirt. I mean, his dam, she hasn't produced much, but she was a stakes winner. She was a dirt horse. So reason to believe he'll get her to the surface, but he is just a hopeless long shot being here. Has so much to prove, and certainly not worth trying to back him over any others in here. The 8 Lost Ark, the other Todd Pletcher runner, Louis Saez aboard. Really impressive in his first 2 starts. Then the Breeders' Futurity came, and he kind of just spun his wheels, it felt like, around Keeneland. And I'm not really sure why. He seems like a quirky horse. He has a very weird stride. Broke his maiden nicely at Belmont by 5.5. Followed it up with a win in the Sapling. That was going 2 turns, so it's not a distance thing. And that was a 7.5 length victory. Major Dude, who's going to be a nicely backed horse in the Juvenile Turf, was 3rd in there. So he was so good. And then the Breeders' Futurity just, I don't know if he was too far back or it was, just off that day. I have no answers, because it wasn't distance, wasn't kickback, it wasn't any of those factors. It was just kind of a confusing run. And when you think about where he was placed, yeah, he was, second to last at the first call and pretty far back throughout, but the pace was there for him to pick up into. I mean, the fractions were beneficial to a closer. So I have no answer. It just seems like he's kind of a quirky horse. It makes sense when you think of who he's related to. He is out of the wonderful mare Marion Ravenwood, who produced Idol and more notably Nest. So horses that I would agree maybe have some quirks to them, as good as they can be, and Violence on the top side. He also throws some interesting characteristics to his offspring. And this horse, like I said, he's a pretty weird strider. He's got a very weird paddle thing going on when he runs. So all that could factor in. I just don't have an answer for the Breeders' Futurity. And maybe Todd Pletcher doesn't either. And that's one of my favorite angles in racing, is the trainer can't explain the bad performance. But I haven't seen him explicitly say that. I think his top gun is definitely Forte, and I think he's a lot better. And if we keep doing this transitive property thing, Lost Ark's worse than Forte. Forte is not as good as K-Rock. So we'll just leave it at that. The 9 is Curly Jack. He won the Iroquois Stakes in his most recent start. Grade 3 winning her in for this spot. Good job by Tom Amos, I think. He's done a lot of good work with this colt. Showed a lot of promise when he broke his maiden. I felt like he kind of disappointed in 2 stake starts since, or in the 2 stake starts between his wins. Even though he ran well, you certainly would have hoped he had won. But the Iroquois, I was impressed by how well he rated, stretching out for the first time, and how he finished hard through the wire. So certainly some positives in this horse as he improved, but he does have to get better. And it's not like the Iroquois is necessarily the most productive Breeders' Cup prep. You have to really just be a standout to, it seems, to win that race or run well in that race, and then also run well in the Breeders' Cup. And the field he beat, and there's just hasn't been much. Jace's Road, who was 3rd in there, was very well beaten in the street sense. Grade 3 last weekend at Churchill Downs. So there's just not good form. The horse really impressed me, I think, in his most recent outing, but there's so much improvement that still needs to be shown, and it's not like the horses he beat in there are of the level of some of this competition in here. So improvement is needed. I will say, pretty cool pedigree note on this one by Good Magic, and another representative for him in this race, and he won a Breeders' Cup Juvenile, and this colt's dam, Connie and Michael, ran into Breeders' Cup Juvenile fillies as well. So it's not too often you see a Breeders' Cup Juvenile race have a horse who's sire and their dam both ran in Breeders' Cup Juvenile races as well. Pretty cool note on Curly Jack. And we'll finish up with the 10 National Treasure, the other Bob Baffert representative. Chased well in the American Pharoah. This is a horse who's always had a lot of hype behind him. $500,000, very well bred, owned by that big ownership group that owns basically every Bob Baffert runner. It feels like nowadays, and they're always chasing the Derby. So always had a lot going for him, and then took care of business really nicely on debut, I thought, at Del Mar. And then the American Pharoah was a good run. He just kind of sat off of Cave Rock, and when Cave Rock kicked away, he couldn't go with, but he still ran a credible second. He was still well clear of Hijazi, and he was more clear of fourth. So he ran his race, and it wasn't the worst race I've ever seen. But it's you're not better than Cave Rock. He'll stood a good trip. Maybe he could be a horse that can run something decent underneath with the right trip, as long as things don't get too hot. But at the end of the day, he's absolutely outmatched by his stablemate, despite that big run last time out. Just really don't see how the tables can be reversed here. So with that, pretty cut and dry. We've been saying it kind of throughout the entire preview. Cave Rock is the choice in here. Going to be a single on all my tickets. Just don't think anybody can beat him. I think that, as well as Forte could run, I think Blazing Sevens would be the horse I would use him in any exactas, things like that, because I really think the progression is going to be there as he stretches out from 1 to 2 turns. And then maybe National Treasure. If he can relax early on, set a nice stalking trip, don't see why he can't grab a piece underneath as well. So that'll do it for this Breeders' Cup preview. Make sure to stay tuned. Across the Racing Rundown Network, we have our full 14 race podcast previewing all the races with our choices in there, in addition to our individual race previews. So make sure you stick around on YouTube for the rest of those, and we'll see you next time here on Racing Rundown.